Your church can have consistent branding. What if I told you that the difference between this church's designs and this church's designs isn't budget, but system? The second church has learnt how to achieve consistency in their visual identity. And so many churches really struggle with this. And that's because we often have many different people designing for church. And many of them don't have formal design experience. And they've all got a slightly different vision of what they're trying to achieve, which leads to inconsistency in a church's visual identity. But today I'm going to guide you through every step of the journey to go from visual chaos to brand consistency. And so the first thing to do is to establish your visual identity. And that might look like creating a visual identity. So if you don't already have a logo and branding, or it might be bringing together an existing visual identity. And I think I'd at least recommend having a logo, a typeface, and some colours. But you can go into much more depth. You can think about things like icons, illustrations, your tone of voice, and then you're going to create brand guidelines. So you'll have a document that includes things like your logo and how to use it, what fonts to use, what colours to use. And this could be as simple as a single page document, but usually it looks more like a booklet with lots of detail and different pages for each aspect of the brand. And if you'd like this particular booklet for your church, it's a Canva template that's completely editable and it goes into loads of detail, and you can find it in my shop, and the link for that is in the description. And I'd say at this stage it's good to be as thorough as possible. I think a little bit of work at this stage will save you lots of time later on. And I would try to think about the questions that people might have when they're designing and answer them in your brand guidelines. And then distribute them as widely as possible. So print them out, give them to people, maybe stick them on the notice board in your office, have a version that's online that people can keep on their computer. You want to make this the go-to place for any questions to do with your brand. But there's no point giving people all this information if you don't train them in how to use it. So I'd really recommend gathering your team together and walking through the guidelines with them. Go through each page with them and see what questions they have and try and answer them together. This is going to really help keep things consistent across everyone who's designing for your church. One thing you could consider if you hired a graphic designer to do your branding is you could see if you could hire them to do some training for your team. They're going to know the brand guidelines inside out. And while you're thinking about training, it might be worth considering some church-specific graphic design training. One of the things that I do is I run a course online that teaches the fundamentals of graphic design and shows you how to apply them specifically to a church context. And the link for that is in the description. So once your team has been trained in how to use the brand guidelines, provide them with all of the assets that they might need in order to apply those guidelines. So for example, make sure that everyone's got access to the right fonts. Make sure that any particular brand assets or variations of your logo are all centralized somewhere. So you could think about having a shared Google Drive or folder somewhere so everything's kept together and it's really organized. Or if your church uses Canva, you could utilize their brand kit, which is something you can get with Canva Pro, and it allows you to upload your logos and all of your brand assets to Canva so that everyone on your team has access to those things. And this just makes everyone's life easier. Another thing that you can do in order to maintain brand consistency is to use templates. So this involves creating one model version of a flyer or your bulletin, and this can be a great tool for brand consistency. It means your logo is always going to be in the same place and they're always going to be using the same fonts, and even the layout is the same, and so the overall feel is really cohesive. And you can create templates for all sorts of different documents. However, I do think you should take care not to overuse templates, and let me explain why. A really simplified version of a design process is that you start by thinking about the purpose of your design. Then you might think about what content you want to include in order to achieve that purpose. And then finally, you make design decisions based on the purpose that help you include all of the content. However, if you're using a template, the design decisions are made before you've even started thinking about the content. And so you end up trying to fit the content into pre-existing design. And so sometimes you end up with designs that just don't work and aren't fit for purpose. And so all these things have been about equipping your team, making sure you're all on the same page and everything's centralized and everyone's got all the tools that they need. But then in order to maintain brand consistency into the future, it's really important to regularly audit your brand. And so I'd recommend giving one person responsibility for brand consistency. So that person is going to be your brand champion. And they need to be really familiar with the visual identity of your church, and they also need to care about it. So maybe once every few months or once a year, they'll look through your website, your social media, everything you've printed, and they'll look for areas where maybe you're lacking in consistency. It might look like going through a checklist of things that are particularly important for your church. And so if they're regularly conducting an audit of the church's visual identity, then there needs to be opportunities for feedback as well. So consider how you could be sharing feedback with everyone who's designing for your church. And just be careful in how you do this, especially if people are volunteers or if maybe they're lacking in confidence, but sharing some trends and some areas for improvement regularly with your team is only going to be a good thing. And so if you're completing all of these steps, you'll find that your church's visual identity becomes much more cohesive. And so it's really recognizable and it builds trust with your community. And that's what good design does. And if you'd like to think a bit more about why good design is important for churches, I'd recommend watching this video next, where we think a little bit about what the purpose of graphic design is for churches and why it's something we should care about. And it also happens to be lesson 1 of the course that I mentioned earlier. And so if you'd like a sneak peek at that course, then this would be a great video to watch next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.